Does your pattern call for a half square triangle block? Or maybe within your block pattern, you need to incorporate several. There are so many ways to make a half square triangle block. I've gathered 10, but how do you know which one's best to use? Well, stick with me and I'll show you how to do it. Hi, I'm Karen Brown of Just Get It Done Quilts. I give you tips, tricks, and strategies to help you make the quilt that you want to make. And please help support the channel by clicking that subscribe button. After learning to sew squares and rectangles together, the next skill to master is the half square triangle. They make amazing quilts just by changing color and value. They are also building blocks within larger sampler blocks. There are so many ways to make half square triangle blocks. Some methods are straightforward, some are fussy, and some appear almost magical. So let's see what method works best where. First, what is a half square triangle? Well, it's a triangle. This angle is 90 degrees, which is sometimes called a right angle. And these two angles are half that size at 45 degrees. That means these two sides are exactly the same size. HST is short for half square triangle. And when we sew two of them together, that's called an HST block, but often we call that an HST2, just to confuse the new quilters. There is a lot of acronyms in quilting. Check out my video, Breaking the Code, to learn more. The easiest way to make an HST is to take a square and cut it in half along the diagonal. You can use the 45 line on your mat or the 45 on your ruler, or just line up your ruler between the two opposite corners and cut. And what size should the square be? You take the finished size of your block and add 7/8. Then sew two together along the longest side. The challenge in this method is not to stretch the seam while you sew. And you also need to be careful and steady to sew straight. I have several tips on how to get this right in my video, How to Sew Straight and Making the Perfect HST. And I'll leave links to them in the notes below. This is a good method if you only have to make one or two HSTs, or you want a lot of variety in how you pair up your fabrics. However, I find 7/8 a fiddly mark to line up to, and it's a really easy block to be out of square if your angle is just off by a touch. So I cut my block at 1 inch larger and then trim back. This means I have an extra step of squaring up, but my block is perfect when I do. You're cutting a square? Why not just make two at a time? The math is exactly the same for one, but instead of cutting along the diagonal, you mark it. Then sew a scant 1/4 inch down one side, then back along the other. Cut through the middle and you have two similar HSTs. You can also use this 1/2 inch ruler to mark the sewing lines instead of a center line. By keeping your fabric in one piece as you sew down one side and then back up the other, gives your fabric more structure to prevent it from stretching. And I like to give it a press before I cut along the diagonal, just to set the seam first. The challenge with this method is you no longer have an edge to align your presser foot against. You can use low tack washi tape to give yourself a ledge, or just use a steady hand. Honestly, I use this method even if I only need one HST. If I can't use it on my top, I use it in the back. If you only have charms or mini charms, you might consider this method. You mark the diagonal, but this time you sew directly on the line. Then you trim at 1/4 inch. This way, your HST block is exactly the same size as your original square, which is really convenient and really cuts down on your cutting and trimming. It's also the best method if you're fussy cutting. However, this only makes one HST block and the rest is waste, which is a big waste. So I will often make a bonus HST by marking over a 1/2 inch and sewing on that line. It makes a different size HST, but I can always use it someplace else. For this method, with two squares together, you sew around the outside edge. then cut on the 2 diagonals. The first time I saw this method, I thought it was so clever. You almost want to say ta-da as you open them. And then you realize that all your blocks are cut on the bias. And not only can they distort as you sew them together, they can continue to distort as you sew your strips and rows together. Starch can help minimize this, but be very careful while you sew. This method is often used with pre-cuts to give yourself another size option, but with those pinked edges, it's often very tricky to make that 90-degree turn accurately. And the math for this method is a bit complicated because this is the finished size, but you can use an approximate by adding 1/2 inch and then doubling it. For example, if you needed a 2-inch block, you add 1/2 inch, that's 2.5 inches, and double it, so it's 5 inches. But do know that you will have to trim it. Honestly, I used this method once and I never used it again. This method is just compounding the 2 at a time method, doubling the size of both sides, so that the square that you cut is actually 4 times the size. Mark both diagonals. Then sew a scant 1/4 inch seam on both sides. Give it a good press before you cut to set your seams. Then square your piece on your cutting mat, ensuring that the corners are square. Then make a horizontal cut in the center of the sides, and then make a vertical cut in the center of the other sides. Then make your diagonal cuts. So there's a bit of extra work here to measure and mark. You also need larger pieces of fabric, and sewing a longer, perfect diagonal is much harder to do. But I do find it's the fastest method for quantity. Here I also add 1 inch instead of 7/8 in my calculations. But don't hesitate to make your square even larger, especially if you're a beginner. Whether you add 1/8 inch or 1/2 inch, you need to trim them up anyways. You can also use the same principle and expand your marking to make a larger grid and more. But note that if you're looking for an assortment of HSTs, this method might not work for you, as this produces all the same block. For this method, we use with the fabric strips like jelly roll strips or larger, and you use the easy angle specialty ruler. You lay your strip down and align the ruler to the same width as the height of your strip. I put a ledge of washi tape on both sides of the ruler to butt up against. You cut along the diagonal, then flip the ruler, align, and then cut up the other side. This method is good for when you don't have the height to make the 8 at a time method, or perhaps you're cutting squares. This will make HSTs the same finished size. It does have the same issues as method 1 with the bias seams, so be careful not to stretch. This uses the same method as the 8 at a time method, but it's paper piecing. With the sewing lines already marked for you, your seams and your cutting lines can be more accurate. But like all paper piecing, removing the papers can be pretty darn tedious. It's also an added expense. And you will need multiple paper sizes depending on what size HSTs you're making. This method doesn't work for me, but I do have friends that swear by it. This is another one of those magical methods. You sew 2 strips of fabric together on both sides. You may have a top stitch to remove here, but then ta-da, you have a completed HST. The math is a bit tricky because this is the finished size. The height of the strip is equal to the square root of the finished size squared divided by 2 plus 1/2 inch. A much simpler way is to just take the finished size and add 1/2 inch. Then find the corresponding measurements on your ruler and place a tape or mark between them. Then align this with the stitch line and trim from there. This method is great when you can combine multiple strip sets together. And it also gives you another size option for jelly roll strips. But all the blocks are on the bias, just like the 4 at a time method. And once they're on the bias, they're always on the bias. so be very careful with them. This time our strips are cut on the 45 and then sewn together. Then you use your triangle ruler to cut the HST. So your blocks are on grain, and it might be a great method if you need a lot of the same block. But you need yardage to make bias strips, and honestly, this method is just a little bit fussy for my taste. So most of these methods are for HSTs that are all made with the same pairs of fabric. This accordion method is about scrappy HSTs where you want no two identical pairs. You mark your sewing lines, then add an HST to the right side. When you are done, you flip that piece to the left and then add another one to the right. And then another, and then another. Then trim in between them with your scissors. I first saw this method on Paige's YouTube channel. She explains it extremely well, so I will leave a link to her video if you want to learn more. She has a specialty ruler she recommends to trim them up fast, but I tried to order it on Amazon.ca and it was $70 something. And then I tried to import it from the US and it was even more money. So maybe one day when the border opens up again and I find myself in the US, I'll take one for a test drive. For most of these methods, if you are using two solid fabrics, all your HSTs will be the same. But if you are using stripes or directional fabrics, your HSTs may differ in appearance. I have a video called Stripes that showed the different results. And if you haven't seen it, I'll leave a link to it in the notes below. All of these methods have pros and cons. It's important that you test them out to see which ones work best for you in different situations. I will have a link below for the specialty rulers and the HST papers for the ones that you want to try. And don't hesitate to make a couple of extra HSTs if that's the easier method for you. You can always use them in other blocks or in your after quilt. Last week on Karen's Quilt Circle, I had the colorblind quilter. Tom was an excellent guest with all kinds of tips, and he has provided a handout of specialized color palettes, so make sure you check that out. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell beside the subscribe button so that YouTube will notify you when I make new videos. You can also follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Pinterest at Just Get It Done Quilts, and of course my website, justgetitdonequilts.com. So take care, and I'll see you next time.